Greetings, everyone. Well, I found it. Ammonium thiocyanate. I went ahead and mixed up a little batch here so I can do some testing with it later. Here, I have one bag of micronutrients from growfood.com. As you can see, there appears to be some copper sulfate crystals in it. I will remove these and dissolve them separately later. 294 grams, a little over 10 ounces. While removing the copper sulfate crystals, I noticed there was a lot of black material in the mix. Come to find out, it's magnetic. Hopefully this isn't someone's idea of a soluble source of iron for plants. There ended up being about 18 grams of copper sulfate in the mix. That is nearly 5 times the amount Mittleider called for in his original recipe. Here I have the grow food mix and a batch of my micronutrient mix. I am using iron chelate rather than iron sulfate here. Iron sulfate oxidizes in the soil and makes it much more difficult for plants to use in its physiological processes. As you can see, there's quite a difference in particle size between the two mixes. I'll go ahead and take the grow food mix out to the garage and pulverize it in my blender. There, that's better. I went ahead and zeroed my scale to compensate for the weight of these two containers. "272 grams, coupled with the 18 grams of copper sulfate, a total of 290 grams. And here, 266 grams. Before we go any further, let's take a look at Grow Food's recipe for their micromix. We can find the recipe on page 114 in the book, The Mittleider Gardening Course. On this page, I have added the weights of all the nutrients Mittleider used in his original recipe. As you can see, there's quite a difference in the amounts recommended here. Most notable are those of iron sulfate and zinc. Mittleider calls for 8 grams of zinc, while Grow Food is calling for 113 grams. The iron recommendations are light years apart. While Mittleider calls for 8 ounces, Grow Food calls for a mere 1/2 ounce. With 1/2 ounce being a little over 14 grams, and iron sulfate consisting of just 20% soluble iron, in 1/2 ounce there is a mere 2.83 grams of soluble iron seen here. On page 115, we see the recipe for a 29-pound batch of weekly feed. Adding less than 3 grams of soluble iron to this amount of fertilizer would be a huge mistake. Now you may ask, how do we know your version of Mittleider's micronutrient recipe is accurate? Well, from Mittleider's 1975 book, More Food from Your Garden, page 114 does include the micronutrient formula. Mittleider's book, Let's Grow Tomatoes from 1981, also includes the same recipe on pages 34 and 35. Mittleider's Grow Box Gardens, published 1982, page 71, same recipe. Finally, from Grow Bed Gardening, published 1986 on page 82, same recipe. I have put my micronutrients in this 1-gallon jug, and I will be adding 7 liters of distilled water to it. There we go, 7 liters. I'll put the cap on it here, move it off to the side, and move on to the grow food mix. All right. Well, first we'll add a few hundred milliliters of distilled water to this beaker. Then we'll add the copper sulfate and see what happens. Well, no doubt in my mind, that's copper sulfate. Dissolves very quickly in water and turns the water blue. I'll start adding some water to the jug here and then pour in the water from the beaker. Then I'll finish adding the rest of the water to the fill line. After filling both jugs and putting the lids on very tight, I'll vigorously shake both of them and get them started dissolving. All right, I have both jugs shaken up really well. Let's see what time it is. Okay, here we are about 11 minutes later. Let's take a look at both jugs and see how they're doing. Well, this mix is doing pretty well. Quite a bit of it has dissolved. This one's doing pretty good too. I guess we'll check back in about a half hour. Well, I shook both jugs really well and let them sit for about 30 minutes. Let's take a look at both of them. Well, the grow food mix is doing pretty well. It's only been about 40 minutes, so we're getting there. This mix looks like it's dissolving quite a bit faster. Well, here we are, about a half hour later. I did shake both jugs again really well and just let them sit. Looking at the grow food mix, doesn't look much different than it did a half hour ago. This mix is almost completely dissolved. During the past hour, I have shaken both of these jugs twice and let them settle afterwards. It looks like everything is dissolved in this bottle. If you look really close, you can see a little bit here and there, but I'd say this is pretty much done. The grow food mix doesn't look like it has dissolved any more than what it had 2 hours ago. Well, here we are the next day, 8:05. I did shake both of these bottles several times before calling it a night around 12 a.m. Well, after nearly 9 hours, the grow food mix has proven to be highly insoluble. From a plant perspective, insoluble means I can't access any of the compounds that exist in this solid material. This mix has completely dissolved into the water, which means every chemical compound that we added to the jug is 100% accessible to the plant. Add a little light to the subject, and you can see layer after layer of material that has not dissolved into the water. In fact, if we move the light behind the water, you can still see the light very well through this water. This mix, on the other hand, is so saturated with dissolved metals that you can't even see the light shining through it. This is 1/2 ounce of iron sulfate. I'm going to add this to the 7 liters of water here. According to Grow Food's recipe, this is the amount of iron sulfate that should be in their mix as well. After about a half an hour, the iron sulfate has completely dissolved into the water. The two mixes look similar, but we can see the water with the iron sulfate clearly has more material dissolved into it than does the Grow Food mix. Using a new pipette, I'll get a few drops of the iron sulfate mixture and put it in this lid. Ammonium thiocyanate is very useful in detecting iron dissolved into water. Adding a few drops to the sample in the lid, the solution immediately turns a reddish color. Remember, Iron sulfate contains just 20% soluble iron, so there is less than 3 grams of iron dissolved into this water. With a different pipette, I'll get a sample of the grow food mix and add it to this lid. Add a few drops of ammonium thiocyanate to this sample. Let's see what happens. Well, there's a color change there, but it appears more yellowish green than red or pink. After about 5 minutes, I noticed that the solution from the grow food mix had completely cleared up, indicating that there is absolutely zero iron in this mix. Using a medium lab filter in this funnel, I'm going to pour through all the water and collect all of the solids from the grow food sample in this jug. Afterwards, I'll take the remaining solids outside and let them dry under direct sunlight. The water has stopped draining through the filter. Now we can take a closer look at the remaining solids. Obviously, the undissolved portion of this mix holds a lot of water. After about 6 hours in direct sunlight, the undissolved solids are completely dry. As you can see, there's nearly 148 grams of undissolved material here. That's more than half of what we started with originally. Also, the magnetic particles we found earlier remain undissolved in this overall mix. Should a bag of these micronutrients ever show up at your door, here's what you should do. You should probably do the same for any other products purchased from the company that produces that micromix.